I think hearing about the work that Dasra has been doing in the various sectors, sanitation, adolescent girls, democracy, all of the work we do actually goes towards one common goal, which is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. In case some of you want to be nerdy, 6.2 is sanitation, and I'm plugging that. But since we are, as a country, also committed to achieving the SDGs, there's only one non-negotiable requirement for achieving that, and that is an inclusive movement. We need to collaborate to do this, and that is the only way we will ever be able to achieve the goals, because they are quite ambitious to achieve it by 2030. And to hear about how we could make this a more collective and impactful movement towards that goal, I now ask Deval to please come to the podium.
So welcome again to all of you guys. A lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces seen today. It's a real pleasure to be here for multiple reasons, including, of course, that my parents, my brother, my mother-in-law, and family are here today as well, as they always are. And it's really, they're the ones who had the brunt of the 24-year-old saying we're going to move to India and do something crazy. And they're the reason we're definitely here. I think, beyond them, it's the team that we've been able to assemble that's worked tirelessly, not just for these 3 days, but for 17 years, our board, and really everyone who's here, which are the NGOs, the donors, our partners. And we think it's critical because this next panel, and more importantly, I think where Dasra aspires to be by 2030, as Krishnan said, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we do need to focus on impact first. And when I say we, it's not the 130 plus people at Dasra or our board or everyone in this room. It's really the country as a whole that needs to focus on sort of moving beyond the pledges of giving, which are fantastic, but actually changing the dialogue to impact. And I think this is important because 9 years ago when we launched this particular gathering, to be honest with you, we were much more focused on the pledges themselves. Giving was not as talked about in the country. We had clearly amassed a great amount of wealth, yet people were not necessarily giving it away. Fast forward to today, I'd say every quarter we have announcements of 1,000 to 7,000 crores being committed to the sector, again, which is fantastic and phenomenal. But if we don't actually have impact as part of this conversation sooner rather than later, the chances, again, of achieving the sustainable goals by 2030 are probably going to be slim. And so from a Dasra perspective, we said, let's start actually speaking about impact, not just today, but hopefully for the next 13 years. Let's start figuring out what it means to create this impact, because it is much more than the numbers or the evaluation or the IT systems in place. Creating impact on the ground, number one, is built on trust. And so while many of you philanthropists are in this room today because you guys are looking to get engaged in a much more meaningful manner, both in terms of increasing the capital you give as well as the time and the networks, I think one of the things we need to realize, and we learned this from Peggy Delaney and Synergo some 14 years ago, is we need to first invest in trust in the communities that we're trying to serve. These words, communities and service, I think is something we all need to realize, and again, is a change in mindset. Many of us have had to accumulate wealth by being competitive, sometimes monopolistic, and thinking we are the only business that should do X, Y, and Z. Being in the philanthropy space is really a shift in mindset to say, now we need to be more inclusive, more trusting, and we need to understand from the communities themselves what they need, and then create impact. And so for Dasra, being impact first, number one, is trusting the communities we're trying to serve, listening to them, and realizing that they're the ones who are doing the hard work, not us. We sit at the Taj. But if we can enable them to take a hold of their lives more effectively, if we're able to provide opportunities that the government and the private sector till date have not been able to provide, chances are they will actually be the reason we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals versus necessarily us. And so to build that trust, it takes time, it takes patience, it takes years of work, and that's something I think many times is not talked about. when we talk about philanthropy and we read about it in the papers, it's always about the successes versus the failures. And so in addition to trust, I think the second big thing, I think, for us in this movement of Impact First is actually talking about areas that we haven't been able to achieve. Talking about failures. Yesterday, in fact, at the Bombay Stock Exchange, we had a panel on failures where NGOs themselves talked about the challenges of scale, the challenges of working on certain areas, the missteps that they had taken in terms of relying on an intervention A versus intervention B. And that's really what I think for us, Impact First, the second sort of aspect of it is discussing failures, hopefully more so than we discuss successes. Because I think that's where the real learnings take place. And in philanthropy, and more importantly, in uplifting societies, there is no silver bullet solution. And so if we can talk about what doesn't work as givers and as receivers, I think chances are there's going to be greater impact that occurs. The third area, again, and I remember we had the pleasure of interviewing Nandan Nilekani last year in the India Philanthropy series, and he talked about how in order for individuals to collaborate or organizations, you have to set big, audacious, hairy goals. You have to, again, realize that you cannot do this alone. You have to do this with others. And so collaboration, whether it's with government, whether it's with NGOs, whether it's with other philanthropists, definitely keeping, again, the community at the forefront is critical. And so for us, the third aspect of sort of Impact First is this deep collaboration, again, based on trust, based on admitting and being honest with failures and what's not working, but hoping that you're sort of in line with what the Sustainable Development Goals are, which are fairly ambitious. And for those who have not read it, please do so. But as a giver saying, these are the 1, 2, or 3 goals I hope to achieve by 2030. Because as givers, if we ourselves do not start setting goals and holding ourselves accountable to the society that has enabled us to create this wealth, chances are we're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And so Impact First, again, for us, it's about collaboration, it's about trust, it's about sharing mistakes, and finally, it's about trusting the community and enabling them to lead us versus the other way around. And so as NGOs, we are all started by individuals of passion who want to make a change. Philanthropists are in the same boat in terms of wanting to create the difference. But if we don't continuously listen to the communities who, again, are lifting themselves out of poverty, chances are we'll get it wrong. And for the most part, I would say many of the development solutions that have failed have been a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. And that's really the goal of Impact First for us. So it's not about saying, I've done X. It's not about saying I'm only successful in Y. It's about we together are aiming to solve X, Y, and Z for a 13-year period, or 12-year now, by 2030. And we together will actually be more vocal on stages, on platforms, and on media, what works and what doesn't, and really changing the narrative from a giving pledge to an impact pledge. And so for us at Dasra, that's really what Impact First is about. And we'll be hearing a little bit from the next panel on what this entails. Unfortunately, one of the government officials has had a family emergency and is going to try to come in the afternoon, and so can't be on the panel, but there will still be others in this ecosystem who actually have had this Impact First lens for a while. And we're trying to give this platform, and hopefully many more to go, to sort of have those conversations in addition to the funds I've received, the people I work with, and the funds I give out. Finally, Gates and both Melinda and Bill Gates clearly are in the papers quite a bit about their giving, their philanthropy, their involvement. And so we're fortunate to read a lot of these articles, and this one actually just came out on February 16th. And the very last 2 sentences, I think, really took me because it was relatable. And so I'm just going to read this quote to you guys, and then I'll explain why. Bill and I have been doing this work more or less full-time for the past 18 years, says Melinda Gates. That's the majority of our marriage. It's almost the entirety of our children's lives. We do the work because it's our life. I say this to you guys because Nir and I have been fortunate enough to be doing this work for 18 years. It has been our lives. it outlives our children. And we have been able to really create impact at a very, very, very small scale with all of you guys in this room. And we're so bullish, though, that what you guys have versus what we had at the age of 24 is far greater. And you have networks, you have access to capital, you have platforms, you have phenomenal governments and NGOs and foundations looking to work together. And so really the Dasra pledge of 1 billion thriving with dignity and equity is not just us, it's actually us believing in all of you to make this happen. And hopefully, 13 years from now, many more people can say the same thing that Melinda Gates says, which is you and your families have spent a lot more part of your life focusing on changing lives, in addition to, of course, acquiring assets for yourself, and then achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you so much. I would like to call the next panelists up. So we have Anand, Sinha, Roopa, Kudva, and Vanessa from SNEHA. So Vanessa represents an organization called SNEHA, who we've worked with for many years, focusing on maternal and child health across Mumbai. Anand works with an organization called the Packard Foundation that has done phenomenal work for generations in this country in terms of, please come up, sorry. No, come. So Anand works at Packard Foundation that's done phenomenal work, again, in multiple areas in India, and was with the Gates Foundation before this. And Roopa was a founding team member of CRISIL, and about 2 years ago decided to devote her life into this philanthropic space by running Omidyar Network.
All right, thank you, Deval. Good morning, everybody. So this is the first panel, and we're going to try and keep this upbeat so that it sets the tone for the rest of the day. Now, finally, you've told us what ImpactFirst is about. This is a question that the panelists and I have been asking Deval for the last 2 days, is what are we going to be talking about? Tell us about ImpactFirst. And thank you for that wonderful overview. I think we get it. And I think what it does is that it sort of signifies a change in perspective, a different way of looking at what we do, and maybe thinking about how we're going to sort of change the way that we operate in this area of work or in this area of business. One of the things that struck me was really the point you made, Deval, and even Krishnan made about collaboration. It's sort of seen as a prerequisite. And that's one of the questions I wanted to ask the panelists. I'm going to turn to Roopa, you first, is maybe just sort of, we think of collaboration and convergence as an obvious good, as a thing that is a requirement and a prerequisite. But it's not always easy to pull off. It's one of the hardest things. I keep on hearing about governments sort of saying, struggling with the issue of convergence a lot of the times. And also, I don't know if it always necessarily makes sense. Is it always, when I used to work at the Gates Foundation, there was this big placard at Seattle that said, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. And then we used to say, well, we want to go fast and far. Now, and how do you manage that together? So what's your experience or what's your perspective on the issue of collaboration? Is it always easy? Where does it not work? And where does it work best?
Thanks, Anand, and good morning, everyone. Deval and Neera, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's an absolute privilege and an absolute pleasure. If Deval started by talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are big and audacious, and what that essentially implies is that through all of us collectively, through our work over the next coming decades, we'll have to work to impact many, many lives. And it is our belief that if we can work to accelerate the development of an entire sector, we can impact far more lives than any one single firm can do. And if we really have to accelerate the development of an entire sector, we have to support organizations at 3 levels. Number one is the innovative entrepreneurs who bring in new ways of working into that sector. So these could be social entrepreneurs, these could be for-profit entrepreneurs, and that's a theme I'll come back to later. So that is one. The second level at which we have to work is the level of people supporting people who create sector-level infrastructure. And think about organizations like Teach for India, for example, which is working to create, to develop fabulous teachers, which are an essential component of sector infrastructure. And the third level that we have to work at is supporting organizations that can drive the much needed policy reform in each of these sectors that we are working with. So if we are going to adopt a sector level approach, which is essential to impacting many, many lives, then what is essential is how do we learn to collaborate with different actors at different levels, be it the entrepreneurs at one end, be it the people who create the sector infrastructure, or figure out ways of working creatively, productively with the government. And I would say that it is only if we figure out how to collaborate between the players at these three levels can we really create, not just create impact, but we can amplify impact significantly.
Vanessa, tell me about a little bit, we were talking earlier about this issue of collaboration and convergence, and what does it mean in terms of being seen as, again, an obvious good versus having its own sets of problems and issues?
So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Deval, for calling us on the panel. So actually, when I look at collaboration, I look at it at three levels. One is collaboration with the government, and I don't think any NGO can ever scale without partnering with the government. The second collaboration is with other NGOs. I think a lot of us are working in the sector, and it's an extremely fragmented sector, so it's collaborating with NGOs. And the third is collaborating with the community. I think the community themselves are so powerful, and we often underestimate the capacity of the community. I want to just share this with an example with each, if I have the time. One is collaboration with the government, and SNEHA has always believed in collaborating with the government. In fact, we co-design systems, co-design programs, keeping in mind the government system. And from our own experience, we have seen that like in any corporation, there is always a segment of people within the government who want to make a difference. And the key then is to identify that segment and to be able to work with that segment. The kind of scale that we have achieved, and I'll give you a simple example of our maternal and newborn health program, where we created a referral system for high-risk pregnant women to reach the appropriate health facility in the shortest possible time. And this was done in a very participatory manner with different levels of workers of staff at the government system. And after about 8 or 9 years of collaborative working with the government, the entire process has now been institutionalized. Now, while the effort takes a lot of effort, the result is amazing, because today you have 8 municipal corporations in and around Mumbai, which every year there are 33,000 high-risk women who, if they do not reach the appropriate facility in time, will die. That's the kind of impact that you can make. If we talk about NGO partnerships, we actually collaborated with Ekjut Foundation. Ekjut is an NGO based in Jharkhand. And actually, Dasra facilitated that partnership with us. So Ekjut works on maternal and child health. And the communities they were working with faced extremely high gender-based violence. So since SNEHA also works on gender-based violence, we went in as technical partners. And I have to say, we were initially a bit skeptical, because that was our first partnership. Having Dasra by our side was very, very encouraging. And we have always worked in urban areas, and our concern was, can we contextualize the urban model into a rural area? And I think what the partnership needed, was a lot of co-creation, a lot of contextualization, and working together towards common objectives. And I'm pleased to say the results actually came out. The end line happened in December, and the results were very positive. So I think it is possible to collaborate. Yes, there are challenges, but the key is that if you're philosophically on the same page, if your objectives align, And if the NGO has adequate resources, I think it is possible to collaborate.
But Deval, my question is, again, when it's an obvious good, it should be easy to do because it's obviously important. Why is it not easy to do?
We're spending a lot of time analyzing this and struggling ourselves. To give you an example, it's taken us 2 years to create the Adolescents Collaborative. We're fortunate to have many of you guys in the room, USAID, Kiowa Trust, Packard, Tatas, and others who've really supported us in this journey. But to have individuals and organizations in this case who are extremely experienced, competent, and capable to all sort of say, let's put sort of the greater good in front of maybe what we have as our mission or as our vision, et cetera, and come up with 4 simple but critical outcomes and agree upon that. I think that's the hardest part. And it's not just with donors, it's also with our NGO partners, right? I mean, having comprehensive solutions where it looks at health or education or livelihoods or agency, all again saying, while we work with the same community of adolescents, how do we all agree on 4 things that we're gonna look at in the next 13 years to solve? So I think, number one, at the sector level, it takes a lot of time for us to sort of internalize this, to say just because I'm saying I'm gonna do these 4 things, it doesn't mean in everything else I do. I have to look at in this manner, and so I think that's number one, where by collaborating, in no way are we saying everything you do has to be in a collaborative manner. That's not efficient or effective. But joining a few of these initiatives, I think, is critical. And I think with the work that we're doing with, with all of these foundations who've had, shifts in leadership, shifts in strategy, shifts in government, in fact, it is a little bit more difficult. And so it's taken us, like I said, 2 years to bring everyone onto the same platform. But we're hoping that those 2 years ensure the next 13 go much smoother. And that investment of time and patience, I think, is what many times, again, people don't wanting to do because they want to move fast, not realize they won't go far because of that.
Can I comment on 2 aspects here? I think, part of what the issue that you highlighted has also to do with the fact that philanthropists are at different stages in their philanthropic journey. And I think that is also an important factor that comes in that affects how people collaborate. And I think it is, it's a journey which I think Deval and Neera have seen several philanthropists go through. We've seen it in our own case with our founder, Pierre Omidyar, who started off with a charitable foundation, just giving to causes, in a not a very structured fashion, from there to strategic philanthropy, and from there moving on to a stage where you bring in impact investing into your philanthropic mix. So it's a journey. The second point about government, and this is an observation, SNEHA, which I would be curious to hear your perspective on, since SNEHA works so closely with the government. I think it is terrific to see that governments are now much more open to working with nonprofits and actually reach out to nonprofits and engage with them. Similarly to funders, and donors, they are very actively engaged. On the funding side, however, I still feel that governments are at a stage where they view donors and foundations as organizations they can use to fund things which enable them to get around the complex government procedures of putting out tenders, going in for the lowest bidder, and that's one way. And similarly, on the nonprofit side, again, they tend to paint everyone with one brush and expect a standardized approach. Are these issues that you've come across, and how do you deal with them?
So actually, yes and no. On the one hand, we often get government approaching us for band-aid solutions. We need to cover every child in immunization. Can you reach out to all the most reluctant cases? But I think in many situations, the governments themselves are grappling with how do we roll out these policies? These policies are made, but how do we take them to that last mile? And I think there, having an NGO with an evidence-based model certainly helps. I think where we have a couple of problems is, number one, there is no there's no framework for choosing NGOs. Why does government choose NGO A versus NGO B, right? The second is, for us, even if you are chosen and you have to actually execute a government program, there are so many bottlenecks, many of which are not even in your control, and yet you're expected to deliver. So I think those are very fundamental problems, because if you're choosing someone to execute something that you don't want to do, at least you need to make it easier for them. So I think those are the issues that we keep having to struggle with.
So I'm going to turn that question around to you, is that if and Praveen isn't here, so we can, maybe it was a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. So maybe ask that, is that if he was here, right, and if you're saying, okay, what is the framework or what is the type of way you would want to engage with government, right? Because you're right, government tends to look at funders as being people who have monies that can be used in flexible ways that government can't use it. They tend to look at NGOs as partners who can do a cookie cutter approach of doing something in their one district or in their 10 districts that they work in, but they all want them to do the same thing, right? What is it you would want to sort of say, okay, this is what I offer to government, this is what I bring, in my partnership, approach, in terms of what I offer to government? I know we want a lot from government as well, but what do we want to offer them?
I think Vanessa referred to it when she talked about developing frameworks. I think it's, granted that it's not easy to do, but I think a more robust dialogue around what are we trying to get accomplished here? And therefore, laying out in that context the framework of who needs to play what role, so that all the actors who are part of that initiative are clear about where they stand, what their role is, and everyone is clear about how the collaborative effort is ultimately going to lead to the outcome. Today, I don't think that is evident to all the actors who are involved with the government.
And I think that's, again, the critical piece of any collaboration, to what you've just said, and any partnership for that matter. It is about laying down the rules and getting everyone to accept them. And so, again, this is Dasra Philanthropy Week, as we've had multiple gatherings throughout the week. And on Tuesday, we had gatherings in Delhi to bring in the government voice that Anand and others participated in. And we had 2 individuals from the health ministry, fairly senior, who talked very openly, and these are all on videos that we can share with you guys, on their need to get evidence. And so they didn't actually speak about I need NGO to do A or B. They said, I need evidence on what's working and what's not working, because we don't have that evidence as the government. And I think many government officials we've spoken to also say that that evidence may also not be as accurate, because the systems, the approaches, et cetera, are very different that they may use than perhaps the private sector uses. And I think the second big thing they spoke a lot about was that in the government facilities, whether it's schools or public health systems, they can only do so much. And so they were telling the NGOs in this particular case is, help us reach out to the communities, because you're in the communities, we're not. We're not good at marketing programs. We're not good at even understanding. We're the government. We pass great policies, but we're not good at these things. And so I think that dialogue was only possible, again, because there's been multiple conversations, again, with USAID and Packard and SIF and Tatas and really getting these government officials aligned to that. But it is that investment in time. But I think we're seeing, at least there's a shift now from philanthropists and NGOs being service delivery partners only to actually, I would say, closer to policy advisors. It's not everywhere, but I think we're seeing that happen now, which is encouraging.
I want to go back to the issue of impact first, right? And I think one of the things you said is, about 1 billion lives thriving with dignity and equity, right? One of the issues that we've often struggled with at the Packard Foundation is that when you're driving for impact, what you tend to go for is what is most easily measurable or visible. So when I talk about thriving with dignity and equity, I focus on thriving, because I can visualize that most easily, I can measure it most easily. And that's, I guess, my second question is, how do we sort of balance the need for delivering on impact in terms of quantity versus quality? How do you do these large, audacious goals while maintaining issues of dignity and respect, while maintaining issues of equity, right? You want to, cover the landscape with sanitation. We want to uplift from poverty, but how do we sort of, not let that overarching sort of high-level goal often or sometimes lead to sort of the trampling of other softer issues in that. Is that even an issue from the perspective that you come at when you're looking at issues about impact at scale? And what's your sort of take on how does one try and work around measurements to accommodate for that?
So this is actually a very tough one. It's basically quantity versus quality. And I think as NGOs, we're always grappling with, how much do you scale? But then when you scale, are you diluting the model? While I don't have the answer for it, I think I know one thing very clearly. You can only create one Taj Mahal, right? I mean, after that, if you want to scale, you need to figure out, you have to introduce innovations, you have to work differently, you have to address processes differently, you have to introduce technology, different monitoring evaluation systems. So that's clearly the only way to get to quantity. Quality is very difficult when you're working with issues like behavior change, for example. A behavior change is not something that can be done with a mobile phone. I can take data in on a mobile phone, but when I want to talk to a woman who is experiencing violence, I mean, clearly I cannot use technology for that, right? Because it's a patriarchal issue. There are generations of women who have been beaten up before her, right? So I think somewhere we have to balance. There are some programs that you can, and some aspects of your work that you can clearly work at scale, but there are some aspects that need human intervention. I think that's the critical point, where just driving and driving numbers is not sufficient if the actual change on the ground hasn't happened. So somewhere in your programming, you have to make sure that your quality is maintained, and therefore, what is it in your intervention that gives you the biggest bang for the buck? And I think if we can focus on those 2 or 3 things and scale those 2 or 3 things, yet not forgetting the human aspect, I think that's the only solution.
How do you sort of deal with, as a donor, how do you deal with the issue of, getting your grantees or recipients, organizations that you invest in, sort of communicate to you that they're delivering on the high-level goals, but they're also taking care of the softer aspects? I mean, what are the examples that you sort of come up to you as being good examples of where you felt, I've seen both sides of this, sort of coin being addressed?
So one of the fundamental approaches that we adopt while working with nonprofits is to provide what we call core funding, as opposed to funding for specific projects where you would like to see, 95% of the money going to the ultimate target beneficiary or population. Our philosophy is that you've got to give the entrepreneur space. So it's about understanding them, understanding their strategy, understanding their philosophy, understanding what they are trying to get done, and buying into that vision. And once you do that, our approach is to say, we trust you, we like what you're doing, and here's the core funding. And I think that becomes very important, because I think the donor community also needs to recognize that nonprofits need to invest in capacity building within the organization. They need to invest in technology. They need to invest in hiring top talent. They need to invest in developing those metrics for monitoring, tracking, et cetera. They need to invest in disclosures, transparency, reporting, all of which I think are really important today to building trust in nonprofits. And I think, at the highest level, we leave it to the entrepreneurs or the nonprofits to come up with their metrics. I think the whole idea flows from the basic philosophy. But at the highest level, I would say metrics are at different levels. One is, we look at metrics in terms of reach, in terms of engagement, in terms of specific projects, et cetera, which are transformational in terms of changing the sector and which can be replicated by others. So at the highest level, we would have metrics at these 3 levels.
Can I go back to the question about capacity? And I'm going to address this to Vanessa and to Deval. Are we doing enough in this sector to focus on building the capacities of NGOs if we're seeing them as delivery partners? I mean, what more needs to be done if we are actually, again, we tend to think about impact, and as my sort of belief is that a lot of the traditional focus on giving, in that process of giving, we ask for accountability of how was that dollar used, right? And we think of our dollars being used when it meets the beneficiary, right? We don't necessarily think about the organizations and the people who are doing, the work, and how are we sort of, building capacities of those organizations. Are we doing enough there? What else needs to be done apart from, I think the important sort of approaches that Roopa talked about in terms of core funding?
So I think definitely I fully agree with you, Roopa. I mean, there's no way that you can build, scale, innovate without organization capacity building. But I think that's changing. I think there's a lot more donors that today recognize the importance of capacity building. I actually think we should go a step further than that. So for example, there are a lot of philanthropists in this room and a lot of corporates who fund us, who, when they run their businesses, they are dealing with multiple stakeholders. They're actually changing the sector. Okay, so for example, every mobile company wants to put a mobile phone in the hand of the last human being in India. Why can't we use those similar strategies to reach the last human being, right? So that kind of thinking and that collaboration for that kind of thinking is what we would like to look for. The second is in terms of shared services. As we grow, managing your back end is extremely difficult. It's not just a matter of money, it's a matter of technology, technical skills, know-how, etc. So we have hundreds of BPOs and KPOs for the corporates. We don't have enough for NGOs. In fact, we actually did outsource just our payroll as a trial. And it made such a phenomenal difference to our HR department and to the quality of services. So those are the sort of, the same kinds of services that have worked in a corporate sector. Why can't those be replicated to the sector?
So Deval, are you seeing the development of that landscape that is most supportive of sort of, building the capabilities or serving the needs of these organizations that are working at the forefront, right? Or providing these sort of back-end services. Is that developing in India, or is that some ways to go? I mean, what does that look like right now?
I think it definitely has a far way to go. That being said, for example, the leadership program that Shashank spoke about that we ran with Harvard and Ashoka University this year, we had 65 organizations present. In addition to that, programs that Omidyar Network has supported Dasra to do in other leadership aspects and forums. This year, we've sort of trained between 180 to 200 leaders. That was very different 10 years ago when we started this program. When we started the program, NGOs themselves would actually say, I'm doing a disservice to my organization by spending 3 weeks away with 35 other NGO partners, and it's not good. And we would say, look, in 15 years, you haven't taken a break to spend 3 weeks away to think about strategy, to think about scale, to think about impact assessment. You're so busy doing 8 different jobs that this time away, number one, will actually help your organization grow a little when you're not there. But more importantly, you can learn from your peers on what is happening, what they've tried and failed at, and you could really sort of reinvent really where you want to go as a leader, which is critical, I think, for any organization, and really think about where the organization needs to go. And so I think the demand side has grown significantly. I know when we started this program in Hyderabad, it was like pulling teeth to even get 15 NGOs to participate. Now, we ourselves and others around the country are running accelerator programs and leadership programs, et cetera. So there's probably about 500 to 1,000 NGOs and social businesses that are working towards upskilling themselves. I think at a funder level, though, we still have a while to go where people are saying, 100% of our funds, like Omidyar Network does, can be used for capacity building, because in essence, if we can teach these organizations how to fish, they will be far better off than if we just keep giving them fish and restricting them with our strings attached and our grants saying you can't do X, Y, and Z and build your own team capacity to create this scale.
I just have one final question before we turn it over to the audience. And Roopa, I'm just sort of specifically at you, but I would love comments from the others, is when we think about impact, we think about sort of, scaling things, right? Doing things at a large scale. But we also recognize that there is a need to think differently, disruptively, and create new solutions, and then take those to scale. Is it part of an organization's DNA to be able to deliver both of those? Does it require a variety in terms of ways that we engage with different types of partners? Is it something that we can expect out of the same funder, the same NGO, the same partnership, or, I mean, how do you sort of create that landscape? Because you did talk about sort of, sector-wide change. And one of the things that, I often struggle with is the question of saying, there's one person who can deliver at scale, but there's one person who can think of a smart solution. They're not necessarily the same people. How do I try and bring them together, but does that always work? What's your experience or perspective?
So here's where I come in to do my plug for impact investing. I think if you look at any sector globally today, we are seeing sector after sector seeing major disruptions. And if you look at the kind of sectors that philanthropists tend to work in, we are dealing with problems which are intractable. These are problems which have existed for several decades, if not over 100 years. And so therefore, I think it is reasonable to assume that, you will not achieve impact at scale unless you see major disruption. And major disruption typically tends to come from entrepreneurs who are outside the sector. We've seen this happening in the for-profit world. I don't see why, and we are beginning to see it happening in the non-profit world. And if you're looking for entrepreneurs who disrupt, they very often tend to be for-profit entrepreneurs. And therefore, I think philanthropists need to think of what are the tools they can use to drive change in the sector. And part of it may be for-profit investing and supporting these entrepreneurs who cause major disruptions in education, in digital health, in property rights, and things like that. Now, I think the first dilemma here is the way philanthropists think is I make my money on one side, and my philanthropy is to give it away. And how do I reconcile the two? And how can I reconcile the fact that if I invest, I may make money out of it, or may make profits out of it? And I think that's a legitimate concern. But I think impact investing is a growing field where philanthropists are recognizing the need to fund these disruptive innovators, and any gains that they happen to make from these investments can go back into the sector. So there is a way of getting around the issue. But I think not using one of the tools that you have at all the tools that you have at your disposal to drive sector level change is actually not really leveraging the full power of philanthropic money.
Great. I'm going to open it up to the audience. I think we've got a little bit of time for Q&A from the audience. So are there any questions you guys have in terms of impact first or whatever we've been talking about? Yes.
The question I have, thank you for that very incisive roundtable. The question I have, and the panel addressed the issue of quality and quantity and the trade-offs as you scale, and for the back end, outsourcing could be a great potential. But you didn't talk about the constraints of talent. What is, as you scale, how can you bring in the right talent? Are you seeing that shift? Are people being able to make careers in this sector away from the for-profit sector? And is that being done, is that happening in a scalable way, in a legitimate way? And part of scaling up is dealing in organizations that large organizations have problems. In the UK now, we're seeing scandals in these large organizations. That means controls have not been in place as are needed in large organizations. And somehow that creates distrust for the whole sector. So you need to have the right people and the right caliber people. So how do you address that as you scale?
So, there has definitely been a shift in terms of people wanting to move to the development sector. I think, earlier the whole idea of the development sector, somebody, walking around, with a jhola and chappals is quite different. I think today people realize it's a far more professional sector. So there is movement. It is still very difficult. It's not enough. But, in my own personal experience, I think it's not enough to just want to move. Very often people come into the sector thinking it's an easier job. And I have to say, it is far hard. I mean, I've spent 21 years in city, and I've spent more sleepless nights in my 5 years at SNEHA than I have, I think, in the 21 years at city. So it is really a hard job. So unless you are there for the right reason, honestly, it's probably better not to have that person at all. Okay? Having said that, I think it's a role that we NGOs have to play as well. Okay? We have to build we have to build the perception of the sector. We have to make it aspirational for people to want to move to the sector. So definitely there is a movement. I think the other thing is the sector doesn't pay as well, and that often is a deterrent, which sometimes is good because then people move there for the right reasons. But there are some times, especially when people are starting lives, when they do need, in cities are expensive, people do need to pay bills. At that time, I think it is difficult. Many want to, but they can't make that decision. And that again it's a sector issue, where as soon as you move to the sector, it assumes that you pay less. But the way I look at it is investment in a non-profit is actually investment in the future for all of us here. So if we believe that we have to invest in the consumer of tomorrow, the child of tomorrow, I think this whole mindset of the way we price things in the NGO sector probably has to change over time.
There's probably also a perspective of what is it that we're paying for. When someone charges me an audacious bill for, designing my house, I'm like, well, you just sort of, you just put some lines and drawings together, and is it really worth that many millions or lakhs of rupees? There is always this question of what's the value we're getting, and I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves in the sort of social sector is what is the value that we're saying that we're giving ourselves, because there tends to be actually the inverse relationship. I remember when I was interviewing for a couple of jobs, people would say, actually, are you willing to take a pay cut to join, because that was considered as a proof of commitment, right? I was like, no, I'm committed. It's just a minute, I think but that seems to be a sort of an inverse relationship, and that's often what drives away talent, is you're expected to provide commitment and heart and, a desire to do this is supposed to outlive and, sort of outshine everything else. And I think that's often unfair, okay, because that doesn't necessarily mean that you attract the best talent, but it's this sort of metrics of, what is a proof that you're equipped to do this job? The proof that I'm equipped to do this job is that I'm willing to wear a kurta and carry a jhola, is often sort of...
Vanessa, this is a question to you. Here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So you spoke about collaboration between NGOs. And I think personally that is a very, very essential ingredient if we have to go forward efficiently. Now, let's talk of two NGOs who are funded by two different funders. They are in a similar area, but they are in two regions. And each one has had a history. And each one has developed mindsets, perception of their success or lack of success, techniques to do it, and how to measure impact. And now, for logical reasons, we are trying to put these two NGOs together, which I believe is very important because we analyzed a few cases and we found theoretically it makes huge sense. So the question I'm asking to you, because of your experience and your exposure, what do you think? I mean, do you think this model can succeed and should be driven hard? Or do you feel this is going to be a very, very difficult model?
No, I think absolutely it should succeed. In fact, we ourselves, and at SNEHA, along with our founder, Dr. Fernandez, we debated a lot about how we scale. And we said we have all these models of child nutrition, maternal health, gender-based violence. How do we scale these models? And we figured there is no way that we want to set up branches of SNEHA across India, because we don't have the wherewithal to manage the back end. Instead, can we partner with other organizations? And we've actually had 5 partnerships. We have, I don't know if Urja is here, but Setco Foundation, she normally is here every year, where we replicate our nutrition program. Ekjut on our gender-based violence. Save the Children, we partnered for maternal and newborn health program, where we scaled it across Pune. With the National Health Mission to set up women's health committees across Maharashtra. So, and with Swasti to, again, on gender-based violence. But having said that, I think it's not easy, okay? We learned many lessons, and in fact, BridgeSpan helped us after all this, we did a stakeholder feedback, and Bridgespan helped us to come up with a framework for partnerships. What are the non-negotiables that we have to consider when we enter a partnership? And I think one of the most critical things we found is that our values need to align. I think everything else works if your values align. And the second thing that we found is very critical is that our own staff need to have a different set of skills when you have to work in partnership. So building internal capacity is critical, but I absolutely think there is no other way except to collaborate.
I have a slightly different perspective on that. And that is, I think, why is this, and of course, nonprofits need to collaborate, and I'm not taking away from what you said, but why does this question fundamentally arise? I mean, we don't talk about two corporations collaborating, for example, right? I mean, yes, they may partner, but that's not a fundamental driver of success in the for-profit world. And I think the reason it is coming up so much in the nonprofit world is because we don't have large, at-scale nonprofits. If you look at the largest nonprofit in India, it would have a budget of about 60, 70, 80 crores, not more than that. Bangladesh has nonprofits which are 8 to 10x this size, and the US has nonprofits which are 100x this size. Why is India not able to create a large nonprofit organization? I think is a question that we have to ask ourselves, in addition to the question of collaboration. And I think there the reasons are several, starting with the fact that in order to attract that kind of funding at scale, which also helps you get the best talent and pay them well and things like that, in order to do that, I think we have to address fundamental issues in terms of getting donors to understand nonprofits. Today, less than 10% of nonprofits in India file financial statements. 70% of nonprofits in India have 1 or 0 employees. There are a lot of question marks about people not understanding nonprofits. The disclosure levels here compared to the US are very low. So I think some of these issues, once we start addressing in terms of what nonprofits publish, etc., will enable also greater confidence in lending, in funders and funding them, and therefore create larger organizations. So I think the two issues go together.
Thank you, that's outstanding.
Thank you so much. Okay, one last question. I don't know who had their hand up first. Okay, last question that we're gonna have to wind up.
This is a question for Roopa. Roopa, you talked about the importance of supporting and funding for-profit social entrepreneurs. And I agree they have great scope and potential to impact change. But I also see a lot of financial resources, be it seed funds or venture capital funds or private equity funds, trying to identify those very for-profit disruptive entrepreneurs. So my question is, how do you see the role of impact investors as yourself, as unique and different than the funders in the broader ecosystem funding those very entrepreneurs?
That's a great question. And I actually view the fact that mainstream investors today are getting into impact investing as a huge win. I view it as a huge win for the impact investing sector. You recently have TPG, which has raised a $2 billion RISE fund just to invest in social enterprises, right? You have an entire younger generation of people coming up all over the world who are going to inherit huge amounts of wealth, and I think they are very socially conscious and want to make sure that their investments are made in socially responsible ways. So I think it's a big boost to impact investing. I think somewhere implicit in your question was the fact that are impact investors therefore becoming less relevant. I don't think that is the case at this point, because I think that while deeper pools of capital are now available for social entrepreneurs than were available 5 years ago, the needs are massive. The needs are massive. So I think that traditional impact investors like ourselves view the entry of these new people in as actually making available, the ability to finance not just more entrepreneurs, but also enabling deeper development of the sector by providing exits to early stage entrepreneurs and things like that. So I think it doesn't make us irrelevant. It only enables us to collaboratively do more and achieve far greater impact.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I think, it's been an interesting discussion, and what I'm sort of taking away from this is that as we try and move from sort of, thinking about giving as being, an end in itself to thinking about impact as really being the end that we're looking at, it's not a unilinear sort of, journey. It is a complicated journey. There are things that we will move forward in. There are things that we may have to actually step back on, because we're going to have to be careful about, how we sort of drive towards impact. I mean, and I think that's what we're hearing from this panel is we need to sort of diversify our approaches. We need to think more carefully about, what it is that impact actually means. Do we have, focus on issues, softer issues about quality, about dignity, and respect as we chase those? But I think the other thing is that it's obvious is that one does need to shift their mindset set to thinking about impact, and it's not just about giving. So again, thank you, Dasra, thank you, Deval, for sort of, I think, shifting the, the narrative and sort of moving the, the thinking within us all and, within this audience to thinking about impact. And thank you all, audience.